All right, thank you very much. My name is Pawel Wargocki. Good morning to everyone, and thank you for having me to this webinar. I would like first to thank the two speakers because actually they created a wonderful introduction to my talk. They were talking about comfort and about health, and especially I would like to thank Ollie, who was a member of the HealthVent group, who actually introduced the HealthVent project. So I will not repeat most of what Ollie said. So just don't be afraid that I will be repeating. I'll just give you a little bit of the taste of what was it about and what we came up with the main result. But in order to start to my talk, I think there is a momentum, and there were several wonderful questions which actually will be to some extent addressed in my talk. I would like to maybe reflect on those before I go into my talk. First of all, I would like to say about the green materials. I would rather not use the word green materials. We will see the green materials are environmental materials which are ecological, so-called. Sometimes they can be also polluters. So we should talk about the low-emitting materials, materials which actually have low emission. And there are two important projects that are running in Europe. One on the LCI, it's the lowest concentration of interests, to define the list of compounds which we should be concerned when designing the material and the emissions of materials, and the other one is the harmonization of labeling schemes. Both of them, they will be reported as ECA reports later this year or in the beginning of next year. I also think that the wonderful question was about whether the health and IAQ, why we discuss still this issue. So I think it is addressed to some extent, but I believe that we need some systematic approach to address this issue, and therefore this was one of the reasons why the HealthVent project was defined. And also, as regards the cold and hot environments, I think the basic requirements, if defined well, should be the same independently of the climate. Because the ventilation, if we think about the ventilation in the terms as we think in the HealthVent project, is we are talking about the ventilation which deals with exposure. So what was the HealthVent project? Well, the HealthVent project was a project which did not create new knowledge. It actually used the knowledge that exists in an attempt to estimate or to show the framework how we can define the ventilation requirements based on the health requirements. So far, what we heard from Bjarne's and Ollie's presentation, we have heard that one word is comfort. So in case of HealthVent project, we did not want to use a comfort as the designing criteria for ventilation requirement. We wanted to use the health as a design criteria. So the project has been completed, and I showed this slide in the beginning just to make sure that I show it to you, is because there will be a full report of the project later this year or in the beginning of the next year, and it will be published as the ECA, the European Collaboration Action Report, report number 30, and also an archival paper in a journal. So very briefly, today I want to introduce to you the concepts behind designing. This is what we feel how the ventilation requirements based on health should be designed. This is a proposal of the road or a roadmap or the framework how it can be done. Some of the elements can be you can agree with them. With some of them you may not agree with them, but generally we would like to propose this concept in that project. So what is our motivation for the project? The most important motivation is coming actually from the results of the ENVI project and IAQ project, which were completed and estimated what is the effect on health of the exposures indoors. And it has been estimated in the so-called disability-adjusted life years, DALYs, are basically lost years of a healthy life. And the result was amazing to show that one of the most important determinants of health for people indoors is actually ambient air quality when we are exposed to it indoors. And then all the other aspects which are illustrated on this slide are also important. This project, ENVI project, also defined what would be the strategic priorities to control exposures indoors. And among many policies that have been suggested, one of the important recommendations there has been to develop a health-based ventilation guidelines. Actually, they were estimated to reduce the burden of disease because of the exposure to pollutants indoors by a significant amount. So Oli has presented it very carefully and very nicely. So, and there was a question about it. Why do we need a new guideline for ventilation if we already have standards? Well, basically, the reason for that is that current ventilation standards are not based on a hard health data. They are based on the requirement for comfort, or in other way, for the perceived air quality or odor intensity requirements. Requirements are defined for different classes of building users and can be modified depending on the emission, as we also heard from Bjarne, strength of pollution sources. Ventilation rates are not defined on target values of exposures. And in the new standard 13779, there is a requirement, but in generally there has been no requirement regarding the ambient air quality. So because of that, it has been thought, and because of the effect on the burden of disease, it has been thought that we should develop the health-based ventilation guidelines for commercial and residential buildings, excluding the buildings which have a special purpose, such as hospitals. So what are the founding premises? Well, the founding premise of the ventilation requirements should be that this is not a ventilation that affects human health or human comfort. It is the exposure that affects human health or comfort. The exposure should be the determinant of all our actions to be taken when defining all the other actions to reduce exposure and the health effects. And this exposure can be modified by modifying the sources and modified by modifying the ventilation. There could be different sources of pollution which have indoor origin, but ventilation can be, or infiltration, can be a mean to improve, to reduce exposure, but also it can actually bring in the pollutants from outdoors. So it has to be considered as the potential source of pollution as well. So our prerequisites to define the health-based ventilation requirements was first to define the exposure. So we would have to find some target value or some documents which define exposures indoors. And in our case, it has been decided to use the air quality guidelines that have been published by the World Health Organization. This is the scientific state of the art. So it has not been the decision of the HealthVent team to decide which pollutants are important. We actually referred to the cognizant authority who has reviewed the data and has published the guidelines. Then the priority has been given to source control in defining the ventilation requirements. Although we talk about ventilation requirements, we have to first define the source control. So first reduce the pollutants by source control, and then ventilation is only the ultimate measure. So what is health-based ventilation? Health-based ventilation is defined for a specific building when exposures to pollutants meet the WHO air quality guidelines through a double sequential approach, integrating at first source control measures and then the appropriate ventilation requirement. To define this ventilation requirement, we have developed so-called decision diagram for the health-based ventilation. Despite all its limitation, it shows the roadmap or the framework how the ventilation requirements should be defined based on health requirements. The essential elements is that we should start with dealing with the ambient air quality. The ambient air quality is essential. We bring the air indoors, assuming that the air is clean. We have to make sure that it meets the WHO requirements. Once it meets the requirements of WHO, we can go to the building. And then the second step is to basically reduce the sources of exposure to make sure that they meet the requirements of WHO guideline. If they meet the requirements of WHO guideline, then we can say we can define the health-based ventilation requirement in building. If not, there should be a further source control applied. If not, then we should increase the ventilation requirement to deal with the elevated exposures. So how to implement this? Well, the most essential, as I said, point is to acknowledge that we live in one air. There's no difference between ambient air and indoor air because we are actually immersed in one air. We have to admit, and it has to be admitted in the regulations, in the Ambient Air Directive for Europe, and any other regulations which deal with ambient air, that this air is sent indoors and people are exposed to this air indoors for a much longer time than outdoors, and it has detrimental effects on health. The next step is labeling of building consumer products. There has to be harmonized product labeling criteria, and they need to be used already at the design stage of ventilation. There should be a specification of ventilation rate requirements during the design phase. And this is one of the reports that is now being prepared and will be published on that issue. And then we should define so-called the base rate. It's a base rate that it should not be lower. It cannot be lower than this rate. That should be always provided. And in our case, this rate is assumed to be dealing only with occupant bioeffluents. So all the other pollutants are at the level which are required by the WHO at this concentration, and then we have a so-called base rate. And the ventilation requirement cannot be lower than base rate. It can be higher, but it cannot be lower. So there is very little data evidence to select this base rate. But we have decided to propose the 4 liters per second per person as a result of the modeling of ventilation needs to remove bioeffluents and moisture in buildings. One important issue that has already been mentioned by Oli, and I know that the time is passing, so I will be just finishing now, is that we need to make sure that the ventilation system will not become a source of pollution. We have that experience from the past. So the guidelines, health-based ventilation guidelines, not only include the framework on how to design the ventilation requirements based on the health endpoints, but also provide information on how to deliver not with which system, but what should be done so that the system that is used to deliver the air to indoor spaces is not becoming a pollution source. It's so-called qualitative guidelines. So for the implications, there have been different scenarios modeled. What would be the result on the health or burden of disease of applying the guidelines? And the baseline is a 2 million DALYs or healthy life years lost because of the exposures indoors. And the application of the guidelines is the third scenario would actually halve the burden of disease indoors. I will stop here. Thank you very much for your attention.